You probably recognise this guy, especially if you live in North America. He's Jim Farley, the CEO of the mighty Ford Motor Company. And I'm bound to tell you that I'm very glad I'm not in his shoes, because he is not only ultimately accountable for the day-to-day welfare of more than 170,000 employees worldwide, but he also holds in his hands one of America's most precious and beloved brands. A brand that, before he took the helm in 2020, had amassed a slightly eye-watering $160 billion of debt, costing the company more than $1.6 billion per year just in interest payments alone. And now Mr. Farley is about to pick all that up, place it firmly on his shoulders and set out on a metaphorical tightrope walk across the Grand Canyon of transition from internal combustion to electric propulsion. If he makes it to the other side, then there's a massive bounty of long-term profitability and security for the Ford brand and its workforce. If he falters though, he risks falling into the abyss and taking one of America's greatest companies with him. So, no pressure. Hello, and welcome to Just Have a Think. Now, just a very quick note before we get stuck in. You remember in a recent video, I briefly mentioned how I operate as a one-man band here at Just Have a Think, doing everything from initial research to final production. Well, that explanation prompted quite a few of you to ask me to make a follow-up video describing my typical working week and explaining how I come up with content topics and what editing software I use and how I create all my animations and all that kind of thing. So, I made that video. And you can watch it right now for free over at my Patreon page by clicking up there somewhere or by following the link in the description. And if you're someone who hasn't yet subscribed to the channel, well, you really would be making my day if you could click that little button in YouTube. It's completely free, but it really does make a massive difference to my ability to reach a wider audience. Right, let's crack on then. So just like I imagine many of you good folks out there have done, I've watched and listened to several interviews over the past 12 months or so where Jim Farley has been outlining his vision for Ford's electric future. And I must say I like the cut of his jib, as we say here in Blighty. I like his understated pragmatism. I like his refreshingly open-minded attitude. I like his apparent humility and willingness to learn from other brands who are simply doing the whole electric vehicle thing much better and more efficiently than Ford has so far been managing. And I really admire his determination to take one of the world's most established automotive brands on a massive new learning curve that might be quite painful, but which he knows will ultimately secure the long-term prosperity of the company. I think we need a bit more of that in the corporate world, don't we? One of Farley's biggest and boldest moves came in early August 2025 when he announced a clean break from the time-honoured and almost sacred production line methodology pioneered by Henry Ford himself more than 100 years ago, and which is still today the absolute bedrock of the Ford philosophy. We'll take a look at that revolution a bit later in the video, but first of all, let's just have a think about all the existing challenges facing Mr. Farley and his colleagues on the Ford executive board. We can probably split these out into problems at home and dangers abroad. Obviously, all legacy car makers have been trying to come to terms with an extremely expensive transition away from internal combustion engines to electric motors, and Ford is definitely no exception in that. Ford's EV division has lost $12 billion since the beginning of 2023, including $2.2 billion just in the first 2 quarters of 2025. So what's going on then? Well, back in 2021, Farley could see what was happening with electric vehicles in China and decided to launch wholeheartedly into the EV market with a plan for EVs to account for 50% of sales by 2030 and for its European business to be producing almost entirely electric vehicles by that time. The Mustang Mach-E was launched, which by all accounts is a perfectly capable mid-sized SUV, and then the F-150 Lightning, which with its vehicle-to-grid technology and potential ability to power an average home for almost a week, really captured the imagination of many American pickup owners. Sales started quite brightly, but despite 3 pure battery electric models launching here in Europe, Ford's global EV sales figures have been disappointing. That hasn't been helped in the US, of course, by the truly breathtaking assault on anything to do with the green transition, including electric vehicles, that's been inflicted by the recent legislation passed in Congress. The $7,500 federal EV tax credit is expiring in September, and according to Kelley Blue Book, Sales of all electric vehicles in the US only nudged up by about 1.5% year on year during the first half of 2025, with sales actually falling by more than 6% year on year in Q2 as the Trump administration war on all things green started to bite. Overseas pressures also exist. International trade tariffs are hurting supply chains, and as Jim Farley himself said back in February, they threaten to blow a hole in the US auto industry. Farley also reported in June that a rare earth mineral shortage was hurting production, causing the temporary shutdown of one of Ford's production plants. That's not just an EV problem, by the way. Rare earths are integral to all car production lines, enabling basic features like windscreen wipers, seat belts and speakers. China controls those materials, and it's been tightening its grip on their global export volume in response to US tariffs on its other exports. The combination of those production headwinds and open hostility towards electric vehicles, combined with a good dollop of negative misinformation and disinformation in the US press and social media.
We ended the last administration's insane electric vehicle mandate.
Have meant that a Trump-era USA now lags well behind global EV adoption rates. And on top of all that, over 75% of lithium-ion battery production takes place in China, as does most of the refining of the raw materials. It's reckoned that alone gives Chinese automakers about a 25% cost advantage over Western competitors, with Chinese EV makers like BYD enjoying vertical integration, robust supply chains, and economies of scale. Did I mention I was glad I wasn't in Jim Farley's shoes? I think I might have raised a white flag by now. But I guess that's why I'm not the CEO of a corporate behemoth. Well, that's one of the reasons anyway. But the point is, Mr. Farley has got a massive uphill struggle ahead of him. But instead of burying his head in the sand and pretending it's not happening, he appears to be running towards the challenge with considerable gusto. Which brings us to that revolutionary shake-up in production methods that I mentioned earlier. You may have already heard about it. It's called the Universal EV Production System, and it forms the central plank of Jim Farley's $5 billion splurge to have one more go at getting the EV transition right, with the target of a sub $30,000 all-electric pickup to be launched in 2027. We all know the story about Henry Ford and how he himself revolutionised the auto industry of the early 20th century with the famous moving assembly line. The conveyor belt moved the vehicle, and each worker stayed in the same place, specialising in one single task that they got very good at. That initiative increased production speed and efficiency so much that it took the build time for a Model T Ford from around 12 hours down to just 90 minutes. And essentially, that system is still in place in Ford production facilities today. It works very well for internal combustion engine production with hundreds of components, but it's proven to be far less efficient when it comes to putting together an electric vehicle. Farley and his team have travelled extensively in China over the past couple of years, and they've witnessed the breathtaking efficiency with which the large Chinese automakers are able to get cars produced. The Xi'an production facility of the world's largest EV manufacturer, BYD, for example, reportedly churns out 1 million vehicles a year. That's more than 2,700 vehicles a day, or one every 30 seconds. So Ford essentially came back and handed a blank piece of paper to a group of talented engineers and asked them to take the best practice from our friends in the East and create a brand new bespoke production line fit for competitive 21st century electric vehicle production. What they came up with is something they describe more as a production tree than a production line. The whole thing is split into 3 distinct lines at the front end that only converge right at the end of production to become a finished vehicle. That's partly possible because there's no engine or transmission to be integrated into the bodywork, but largely because Ford is embracing the concept of aluminium unicasting, which is something Tesla's already pretty good at, by the way. That does away with dozens of fiddly little components that previously all had to be bolted on or welded together one by one. So one line makes the front section of the vehicle, the second produces the back half, and the third creates the middle part, including the battery packs, which in Ford's case all now use lithium iron phosphate chemistry, which means no expensive cobalt or nickel. By the time the three lines converge, the final stage is more like assembling a kit car, with everything lined up in exactly the right orientation and with all the various tools and fasteners in the right place at the right time. And because each part of the car is put together separately, it's way easier for assembly line workers to get to the areas they need to work on without having to reach around other components that are normally in the way on a traditional production line. That saves time, and it's a nice tick in a box on the check sheet of the health and safety officer. Overall, Ford reckons this new approach is 40% faster than a straight-through line. So the $5 billion that Jim Farley's signed off on has been split down into a $2 billion investment to build the new universal EV production system at Ford's plant in Louisville, Kentucky, creating 2,000 secure jobs, and a further $3 billion at the Blue Oval Battery Park in Michigan, where the lithium iron phosphate batteries will be produced, helping Ford move towards that vertical integration goal I mentioned earlier. And by the way, Ford is also producing an all-electric version of its Bronco model over in China in partnership with Chinese automaker Jiangling Motors, or JMC, using the unibody platform instead of the body-on-frame design of the US version. That China-only model will also use the now famous LFP blade battery from BYD, and no doubt Ford will learn some valuable production lessons from this venture that in the fullness of time they can translate back into US and European production, including insights into battery packaging, safety, thermal management and cost efficiencies that could be incorporated into future Ford products globally. So it appears that Mr. Farley has eaten some humble pie, diligently done his homework, and seen a vision of the future global automotive industry that will most likely only include those companies willing to embrace the changes necessary and make some courageous, well-targeted capital investments sooner rather than later. I hope it works for Ford, because I, for one, think it would be a great shame if such an iconic brand disappeared from our roads. No doubt you've got your own views on the state of play in the global EV transition, and if you're keen to express those views right now, then as always, the place to leave your thoughts is in the comments section below. That's it for this week though. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you found this video useful and informative. And if you also click on all notifications, you'll get a ping every Sunday when a new episode lands on YouTube. You can also support my weekly workflow by joining the fabulous folks over at patreon.com/justheveathink, who help me keep the lights on around here and enable me to keep ads and sponsorship messages out of your way. And I must just give a quick shout out to the folks whose names have been scrolling up the screen beside me here, all of whom celebrate an anniversary of Patreon support in August. Most important of all though, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.